Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darlene Miller-Lanning, Director of the Hope Horn Gallery at the University of Scranton, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a Zoom lecture with Jeremy Dennis, a fine arts photographer whose exhibition, Mapping Shinnecock, Sites and Portraits, is currently on display in the gallery. Dennis is a member of the Shinnecock Indian Nation who lives and works on the Shinnecock Reservation on Long Island, New York. His exhibition, which includes images from his larger online projects on this site, and the Shinnecock Portrait Project, explore issues of Native American identity and culture. Mapping Shinnecock Sites and Portraits, Photographs by Jeremy Dennis, is part of a multi-year series of events at the University of Scranton called Scranton Story, Our Nation's Story, made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. It addresses the project's third theme, Indigenous History of Northeastern Pennsylvania, and through the Hope Horn Gallery, also receives funding from the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, a state agency, through its Pennsylvania Partners in the Arts, administered in this region by the Scranton Area Foundation and supported by the National Endowment in the Arts. In recent years, the University of Scranton has sought to increase awareness of Native American history, and so acknowledges the original inhabitants and nations of the land on which it is located, including the Lenape, the Munsee, the Shawnee, and the Susquehannocks. May we be ever mindful of their legacy and contributions, and commit ourselves to stewarding this land with care and compassion as we navigate our communities towards faith and justice. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Dennis. Jeremy, it's all yours.
Thank you. Awesome introduction. I'm just going to share my screen, so I'll give it one moment to load and show up on everyone's screen. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here this evening. Akwe, that's how we say hello in Shinnecock or Algonquin. My name is Jeremy Dennis. I'm an artist and photographer from the Shinnecock Indian Nation in Southampton, New York. I want to thank you, Dr. Miller-Lanning, for inviting me not only to do the presentation tonight, but for allowing me to show my work in a broader audience outside of my own community. Today, I want to talk about selections from the Hope Horn Gallery exhibit, the two major projects, along with give a little bit of context to some of my work as well. In addition to the awesome land acknowledgement in Pennsylvania, usually wherever I am, wherever I'm presenting from, I usually like to acknowledge that area. I put a little blue star in this case on a illustration by David Bunmartine. He's actually another Shinnecock artist that you can look up. He's a generation above me, but he has a awesome catalog of different paintings that show reenactments or depictions of Shinnecock heritage and everyday lifestyle before the contact period. And so I think land acknowledgements are ever more important because everything that we do depends on land. And if you are able to maybe give or have reciprocity based on the things that you're able to do with that land, it's always good to acknowledge that and give when possible. So I want to start also with the photo I took of the Shinnecock Reservation. This is the community center, and it was built in the 1950s, in part thanks to my grandfather, Avery Dennis Sr. But most notably today is the mural on the right side. That's a mural that my mother, who's also an artist, Denise Silva Dennis, she led a communal mural project in the 1990s, which spans our earliest kind of inhabitants in this area from 10,000 years ago to present times and histories. And so this is just like literally in the heart of the reservation territory. It's where we have historically some of our tribe meetings, but now it's tribal offices. It's where we have a lot of our kind of social events, gatherings, kind of sometimes even workout sessions. And in the theme of mapping, and I love the mapping, I wanted to include a satellite image from Google of the Shinnecock territory. And so as you can see, it's surrounded by water on three sides here in Southampton. And it's about 1 mile north to south, about 800 square acres in space. And the bottom third is actually marshland. So you can see just in the territory of Shinnecock Indian Reservation, all of the land to the south is largely undeveloped because of the property of being like almost at the level of the sea. So if you build there, your house will probably sink or the basement will flood. But it is also interesting for the top 2/3, just to compare it to the outside neighboring villages and towns, just how densely overdeveloped it is and how crazy. But my grandmother, she always used to say, we're still here because there was nowhere left for them to push us to. This is our tribal seal and our flag. The very vibrant yellow represents our place in the nation. If you know the medicine wheel, usually yellow is the eastern quadrant. It also represents the sun rising, and with that sort of hope and prosperity for the future. And within the seal itself, it's kind of really crazy. Like, I love being from Shinnecock, but if you compare it to the American flag, even as an artist, it's really hard to like remember these different elements, try to do it from memory. It's just like even people are inside of it, like very small people as well. But most notably, I would say in the center is the box turtle, which is indigenous to this area. And it actually, both in this illustration and in real life, has 13 different sections on its shell. And here on Long Island, it's believed or commonly understood that there were 13 native communities. So in a way, the turtle represents that community, along with the story of Turtle Island. At the bottom, we have 2 Atlantic right whales. We were people who thrived upon just the offering that whales gave us when they were either beached or if we went out on the local bays or the ocean to hunt them. The Shinnecock text is something interesting. It's not just a font like you see on the rim. It's actually something that we call wampum. And so on the left, this is just a clamshell that you would find on any beach in this area. The unique thing about it is that only in this part of the world, from New Jersey up to Maine and Canada, on the Atlantic coast, will you find this purple hue in the rim of the shell. And I always like to explain it as sort of like when we drink tea or drink coffee. As you do that over decades, your teeth kind of get the same color as the drink. And so with these clamshells, they're constantly filtering the water and absorb some of the microorganisms that are in the soil. And so for thousands of years, Shinnecock people have used this material as a creative expression. And on the right is kind of the output of that delicate process of taking the quahog shell or the wampum shell and turning it into clam beads. And so the most famous example is the Haudenosaunee belt, which is in upstate New York, representing the 5 nations of upstate New York, just a powerful confederacy. And going back to mapping, this is one of our most important maps as the Shinnecock Nation. Just anywhere you look, it says Shinnecock Bay. In the green rectangle, I added that myself. That's the present day Shinnecock Reservation, but in this map, it says Shinnecock Great Neck. Notably on the right side, there's an Indian line representing that pretty much everything in the dark tone is Shinnecock land according to this map. And so what changed in this 1859 period was the Long Island Railroad coming through. And pretty much, I think we all know eminent domain today. It kind of divided the land in half, and then the rest of the land was either stolen through deceit, forged signatures, or other means. And so, so much of what we're trying to do today is trying to regain this land, because with the land, we regain our identity and some of our culture that we lost over the hundreds of years. And so this is one of the beautiful landscapes I took a photo of called The Point. This is a communal hunting ground. It's an area for fishing. Many different generations of parents and children learn to harvest different berries, hunt geese, duck, all kinds of different resources that we just let it grow and thrive here. And so if you know the reputation of the Hamptons, on the other side, in the faint distance, you can see water and then a bunch of houses. So when we go to the shore, we sometimes joke as Shinnecock people that like they get to see our nice reserve and they get to or we have to see their row by row houses or mansions. And so I want to talk a little bit about my education growing up. I went to public school until high school, and a private school in East Hampton for those 4 years of high school. And in my own education, just Shinnecock history in general, any local like New York State Native American history wasn't really a topic that you could learn. And it was usually Thanksgiving. Sometimes it would be the Wampanoag in Massachusetts and Rhode Island area. But it was just a general kind of like this one period in 7th grade that you kind of skip over because usually social studies teachers would mark it unimportant. And even in 2015, according to a Penn State research study, about 90% of content taught about Native Americans up to that point in 2015 was pre-1900 context. So even if there was a curriculum that had Native Americans, it would depict Native people in the past or as a vanished race or something that is in the realm of like archaeology or anthropology. And so going back to Shinnecock, one of the things that also happened in that 21st century history is in 2010, we joined over 570 unique federally recognized tribes in the United States alone. And so what this essentially means is that Shinnecock, even though we're like 1 mile north to south with our territory, we have a government to government relationship with the United States. This designation or title came after 30 years of petitioning. And in a way, it is a little bit dehumanizing because for more than 300 years, we've maintained our connection to the Shinnecock land. We've had our lineage continue. We've always had that connection to local resources, political trade, and all kinds of interactions. But in the 21st century, we now have to prove that we still exist. And so this is a process that most tribes have to go through, especially if they're a smaller tribe or east of the Mississippi. And so this is just a map representing a lot of those 570 groups. Each one of these have their own language, their own connection to land, their own lineage. And so I always try to tell people, since it's so overwhelming to just learn from this and try to absorb it, is to start local. I think if we look at Pennsylvania, you see Susquehanna, you even see Montauk on the east, Delaware. Those are some of the more common names. So if you do want to learn more and just expand your understanding of the land you're on and what has happened there, always try that local aspect. And so for Shinnecock, I think that what we're most known for is our annual Labor Day weekend powwow. In 1946, we actually began this ceremony, and it would have been the 82nd, I believe, in an annual consecutive row, if not for COVID. And so we're hoping that there's no new variants and that we'll have the public back in the largest capacity possible. And this cusp of September and August, we'll just have a complete 4-day event with different canoe races, dancing, art, craft for sale, and traditional other celebrations. And so I do want to mention briefly the Shinnecock Portrait Project. On this slide, I included a couple of different selections from that body of work. But I would say today here at Shinnecock, we have about 1,800 tribal members who are enrolled and all over the world. Only about 600 of them live on the territory itself. And so what I really want to have as the goal for the Shinnecock Portrait Project is to represent every single tribal member. And for me, this is just a sort of a political project. It's about representation. It's about telling our own story and just creating connections among one another. So even though we're such a small community and we have so much going for us with our different commonalities and ways that we're from the same place or we originate from the same land, even then we have political clashes, we have family clashes. I think this is just true in every neighborhood or community. And so to create a body of work for an artist that is all inclusive, all inviting, it tells all of our stories, even if it's a good representation or bad representation, or if it was something that is sort of revealing or very deep. I think that in a way it just shows that we can all be part of something new. We can be part of something that's collective. And besides that, we have also a history of, at first, anthropologists coming into the Shinnecock Reservation and taking photos. And I would say during this time in the early 20th century, this was a source of pride for Shinnecock people, because usually Native Americans in general were being represented as being on the way out or being a vanishing race. The most famous example is Edward Curtis, who received a grant from J.P. Morgan to document Native Americans before they all disappeared, according to that narrative. And so during this time, I think a lot of Native people saw this as like, finally, we're getting represented. Finally, people know that we're here. But I think in the eyes of the non-Native photographer, this was a mission to save Native people before they somehow vanished, but we really never have. And so if you're familiar with Google Maps, I love to use it all the time to get to different locations or just to search around the world. There's this feature called Google Street View. And in this slide, you can see this little orange guy with his hand up. If you use Google Maps, you can actually click this little guy and drag him to any of these blue lines. And by doing that, you get a 360-degree view of that location. If you've been lucky, might have even seen a Google vehicle that has this little spinning 360 camera on top, and it just drives around the world trying to document the whole surface. And so I decided to include this screenshot because if you look at the Shinnecock Reservation, there's no blue lines. And so this is just a interesting opportunity, especially as an artist, because in one sense, maybe Google is respecting Shinnecock sovereignty or our privacy or our borders. But on the other end of that coin, there's a omission. It's kind of part of that larger history of like not having images of Native Americans, or if it is, it's from the past. And so there is a feature where you can actually upload your own 360 photos. And so as an artist, I've been doing these portraits, these interviews, these in the future podcast episodes, and just placing them among the different public roads on Shinnecock. And so it is a mix of traditional portraiture. It's a mix of kind of 3D and digital media. And in a way, it's simply saying that, okay, you can see Shinnecock and its reservation, but you have to be accompanied by a Shinnecock tribal member, which is true even if you're here in person. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of context behind that. If you go to any of the portrait interviews on ShinnecockPortraits.com, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can actually see these individual 360 images. And I think it's amazing because it's such an abstract concept for people to understand. I think when you think of visual art, it's already kind of in the realm of like either luxury or just like maybe it could be just something that people usually don't engage with or spend a lot of time on. But on the left, we have our current chairman of the Shinnecock Nation, Brian Polite. On the center, we have Shanae Bullock, who is now leading our medicinal marijuana business. And on the right is my godfather, Keith Phillips. And he's probably one of the most shy tribal members who are involved in the project. But somehow, even then, I think the power of art is able to overcome those type of barriers. And so since this presentation is on mapping as well, I wanted to include a couple of different aspects from on this site. On the bottom, you can check out the link, jeremynative.com/on this site. And on first glance, you come to this page with a map of Long Island in these different colored polygons. These are different traditional territories. And within those, you have different icons, you have different shapes as well, representing place names. And so if you click on one of the nodes, I'm just going to go to Shinnecock's because I'm being biased. It goes into a presentation like Wikipedia. It just goes step by step into the different elements. And it is a very special project because most of this information, especially about Shinnecock and other native groups here on Long Island, have never been digitized. And so it's amazing that there's just these tomes, these almost like 2-inch thick books on our history that are just sitting in libraries or in historical societies or random kind of library shelves, never really being digitized. And so this project is an attempt to use my skill as a photographer, a landscape photographer in that case, to accompany a lot of this newly transcribed information. So if you Googled Shinnecock Nation in 2015, it would bring you to Wikipedia with 2 paragraphs. But if you Google Shinnecock Nation after that time or today, it'll bring you up to this page with a bunch of different hyperlinks, a bunch of different ways that you can just learn more about keywords. And I just love the project because as an artist, we sometimes think like, is our role in society all that important, or can a pretty picture be that important, or is it just a beautiful image that brings us happiness? And so I try to approach this project as practical as possible. When I went to college at first, I was actually in computer science. So I think some of my semesters in that have helped this digital aspect of my work. And it also kind of propelled me down the more practical route, just to feel like anything you have to do as an artist has to have like a learning element. It has to educate. It has to just have people make that decision that, okay, I'm going to engage with it because I can walk away with something new. And so this project includes many different type of sites, including place names. I think Long Island is really amazing in that sense because some of the towns, some of the roads, some of the beaches are still named after these Shinnecock or Algonquin language place names. And so the strange thing is that some of these are only a sentence in description. Many of them don't have translations into English, but I just love to include them because this is such a densely filled map that once you do have it all laid out, I think it will kind of reveal itself as to like, what do these places really mean? Is it a place that has a local resource and that's why it's named that way? And so I try to just make it as accessible as possible to maybe allow the public or other people who see things differently to figure that out. And so it's not just a website, it's also a soft and hardcover book that I self-published. And hopefully after COVID, we'll continue the exhibits. And one thing I do have to confess is that I was only, well, I should say I was finally 25 when I began to learn a lot of this information. So if you can imagine like all the formidable years of my life of learning things and just starting my curiosity, it was until almost like grad school that I finally started to learn about where I come from, my ancestry, the stories of my landscape, and where we all come from. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the information I read and researched, found, and transcribed. This is the first slide because I often like to tell people that we here at Shinnecock and the Indigenous people of Long Island have been here for at least 10,000 years. And this projectile point illustration on the right is called the Clovis projectile point. And it sort of represents the our earliest presence through archaeological study. But I also like to include this image because it sort of represents the story of Sky Woman. And Sky Woman's story is the origin of why we refer to the Americas as Turtle Island. And so just to paraphrase, a woman drops down from the sky world. She's caught by birds. She's softly landed on the back of a turtle, and different sea mammals come up to the surface, greet her, and begin to take soil from the bottom of the ocean and place it on the back of a turtle. And so it sort of over time becomes the entire continent of the Americas. And people still today say that we're on the Turtle Island, which is an amazing story to try to imagine. But this creation story from native origin is meant to counter the whole Bering Strait argument or theory. And so during this early time, native people lived with nature. I think it's just amazing that through different studies, we're able to tell that like when indigenous people exhausted a resource, they would actually be able to move camp really easily. So at first we were sort of hunting all the time and foraging. Eventually we became cultivators, and then just kind of living with nature, not taking too much and only taking what we need. After the Clovis Point period is the major woodland period. And on the left are different technologies and tools that were developed during that time. I wanted to include another painting by David Bunmartine on the right. It sort of represents how Native people or Shinnecock people would have looked during this 1000 BC period. This was also the time during the late woodland period that we began to transition to farming or cultivation. And so, excuse me, these are the three sisters on the left and their raw ingredients. And they're called the Three Sisters because they're grown together on a single mound. And so if you're familiar with like a greenhouse or you have a garden of your own, beans need something vertical to grow up, which the corn supplies, and the squash leaves are so huge that they protect the soil and make sure that the soil doesn't get too dehydrated from the sun. And on the right is one of our most common staple foods, succotash, which is nutritious and also very delicious at the same time. And so related to food, some people often ask about Thanksgiving and Native American involvement, but here at Shinnecock, we actually have our own celebration called Nanawa, and this is the Thursday before the annual American Thanksgiving, and we have traditional food. On the top right, we have kind of a photo of what it looks like just to sit down, and each table is intentionally mixed, so it's not just like one whole family sitting at one or one whole non-native and one native table. Each table has a mix just so people meet someone new and have new dialogue about their commonalities. So in this later period, about 1524 is when colonists first sort of explored and started to settle here in the Northeast. And so this was, I think many people know, a time of great loss for Indigenous people. I believe there were more than 90 million Indigenous people throughout the Americas before this contact period, and many died just due to being exposed to new diseases, especially in these early years. And here on Long Island between 1610 and 1660, for example, the population is estimated to have decreased from 6,000 to 1,000. But here in Southampton, we actually have a place called Conscience Point. This was actually named because when the English colonists came down from Lynn, Massachusetts, they originally actually landed near Queens, but the Dutch colonists were there and fully established with the fur trade and had villages and forts already. So they were actually arrested and then they were kicked down the island to Southampton. And they were on the sea for so long and went through so much trouble that finally, when they landed in Southampton, a woman supposedly said, "For conscience sake, we're finally on land." And they named it that ever since. And so in 1912, after many hundreds of years, Shinnecock people and the Southampton residents came together to reenact that moment. And it wasn't until 1946 where Shinnecock people took that idea of kind of adorning ourselves with our traditional regalia and having our own powwows. And so this is a photo I took again of Sinead Bullock back in 2013. And so if you've never been to Shinnecock powwow, it's Well, I am an alum of Penn State University, and I would say it's about maybe a 5-hour drive, pretty casually. And so it's the largest on the East Coast. Tens of thousands of people usually come through on the 4-day event. And I do want to also mention, besides some of the general histories, just individual story as well. The one of Sacagawea. I think we all know who she is in a vague sense, but she's such an incredible role model and historical figure who's Native American, because even though disease had ravished Native American populations, we were still a huge military force. We had a huge role in colonial economies, and we were not really forced westward for more than 100 years from that point. And so Sacagawea, during her thousands of mile of journey from Missouri to the West Coast, was 16 at the time and pregnant. At the time, she was leading Lewis and Clark on this journey. And so it's really important to acknowledge histories like this, because it represents female leadership, it represents Indigenous resilience, and kind of counters the common narrative that like Native Americans are like simple. They're these noble savages that are often in the way of industrialization or civilization. But she was actually, in this case, an example of enabling it. And so following that, I also want to mention the Trail of Tears. We all probably know the 1830 Indian Removal Act, but I also like to include it because this was a time when President then Andrew Jackson forced the Cherokee people westward to Oklahoma, in which about 12,000 people were forcefully removed over 800 miles, and more than 3,000 lost their lives due to conditions. And so it's really important to delve and listen to these difficult stories, because, well, the simple explanation is that we won't repeat them in the future, but it's also helping us to move into a more positive future. And so being from Shinnecock and here in the Northeast, I think because we know this Indian Removal Act and Trail of Tears history, it's even harder to accept or rationalize that Native people are still here east of the Mississippi. So part of the work of being an artist is just to share our story, create a visual story, and just try to show it in as many different venues, arenas, educational spaces as possible. And so going back to Long Island, I wanted to include a crop of my mom's mural. This is the earlier period section with the three sisters on the left, one of our huge Atlantic right whales in the center, and it even includes a little box turtle. And so just to revisit some of the slides, Southampton residents arrived in 1640, and in the 1650s, they actually began to create the whaling industry. And the whaling industry itself was hugely important to Long Island's history and economy, because at the time we had lanterns, and the oil from the whale would actually light the lanterns and was a huge commodity both here in the colonies and Europe. But all kinds of different elements of the whale, from the baleen in fashion to the bones in different tools and just carving and visual art, played a huge role as well in terms of collection, a luxury item. And so during the 17th century period, hundreds of whales were harvested towards the near extinction of their species. And even today, there's less than 400 right whales. And so for Shinnecock, this is something that is dear to us. We try to protect whales in every action we do. And even though we don't hunt whales today, we have an environmental department that largely focuses on the erosion here at Shinnecock. I think with climate change and the crazy storms that we're having in recent years, it actually opened an inlet into some of our fresh water. And now that water is no longer a bay, it's now an inlet connected to the water. And so some of our very small territory that we still have is being eroded at accelerated rates. And so this is Siobhan Smith, who was in the New York Times in 2020. And this is Dr. Kelsey Leonard from Shinnecock as well. And Dr. Leonard is a expert scientist on water, a scholar in the legal sense. She does policy work and does creative writing as well around Shinnecock and water. And so I think the younger generation is really reconnecting with our local seas and coastlines. This is another example of some of our Shinnecock tribal members in being involved in canoe journeys, as they're called. And so traditionally, Shinnecock people would actually canoe from, Southampton today or Long Island today, mostly up to Connecticut over the Long Island Sound. And so pretty much anywhere you would go, you would bring a canoe. If there was land in the way, you would drag the canoe over that land and keep going. And so in recent years at the powwow, we actually began to have an annual tradition of racing in the canoe as a competitive spirit type of thing. And so these are just two different examples from 2019. You only canoe about 50 meters and then come back. But the cool thing is that it's a co-ed competition. So you need a man and a woman in each canoe, and then you can win prize money. So it's really incentivizing for the youth to come out and participate. The other thing that's happening right now as well are renewable energy sources. So we're starting to move away from fossil fuels or fracking and trying to depend on solar and wind. But the interesting thing about these offshore windmills is that when the Americas were under glaciers, sometimes more than a mile in height, our landscape and our coastlines where we used to have our villages were actually on these sites that are now miles underneath water. And so it's really interesting that Shinnecock people who have this 10,000 year history now have a stake in these landscapes that are on the cutting edge of the 21st century, especially on the water. And so I wanted to include this slide as well. Shell middens are really cool because wherever you would see them, they're essentially these pile of shells that would come together as kind of like a garbage heap after you have a clam bake, or if you have dinner of clamfish and you just want to get rid of the shells. But pretty much everywhere along water here on Long Island, you would find these different shell middens. On the left, this is actually a reenactment of that and how they were created. And on the right is the famous Shinnecock Hills golf course with a shell midden somehow like in the middle of their greens. And so these are actually everywhere. They represented just the fact that Native people were pretty much everywhere. Like you couldn't have a house nowadays without it probably being like a village site or a campsite in the past. And so you can't really find any of these hills today because a lot of these shells were actually used in fertilizer. Clam are still used as a fertilizer along with fish and seaweed. And that's some of our easy natural resources around here. And others were just thrown into cement mix and used as foundation mix. And so a lot of them were erased either by accident or by purpose. And so I wanted to include Ashwag because along this waterway, which is relatively large, along its entire rim of the coastline was actually 2 feet high of different shell middens. So it's just really amazing that like the population density of Long Island was just so overwhelming. Along that same site was a site of over 400 wigwams. A lot of people, even today, or maybe just children growing up, still think Native Americans all live in teepees. But here on the Northeast, probably including even Pennsylvania, Indigenous people lived in wigwams, weetus or wickiups, they're called. And they were built with these sometimes sapling trees that were easy to bend and different barks or thatches along the side. I'm going to skip over a couple of slides just in favor of time, but I want to point you to the very first site that I included in this project. And if you grew up on the Shinnecock Reservation, you pretty much just know it growing up. This is called Sugarloaf Hill. And this is a photo I took with a drone, but It's pretty much in the center right of the image. You can see sort of a big swimming pool, and it's being lit with the rim of the sun on the hill. And this is one of our 3,000-year-old burial sites here in the Shinnecock Hills. And so I wanted to include this site, and I have so many different photos of this vantage point, but essentially the history is that 3,000 years ago, we had a group burial site here in the Shinnecock Hills, 5 minutes from our current day reservation. And even in the 1800s, Southampton town knew it existed and needed cultural preservation. But in 1989, Southampton town allowed private developers to build this mansion that you see today. And it wasn't even really lived in. It was just kind of like one of those assets that you like build. You don't mess with it. It just increases in value over time, and then you can sell it if you need to. But in 2021, we had a major victory because Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, the rock star, he actually contributed over $5 million for Shinnecock to purchase and preserve this site. So if you can believe it, the site will eventually be in Shinnecock title, and it will demolish the house and return it back to nature. This is another site that you may have heard about as well. This is the Chinecock Monument. And the Daily Show with Trevor Noah, Michael Acosta actually did a segment on this sign. And coincidentally, this is also around that same period of May 2019, where this structure was constructed. And it has a huge story politically and economically. For us here at Shinnecock, it's just a means of economic development and getting passive income through advertisement sales. But it's also an amazing landmark because what's called 27 East, like the major highway that gets to the east end, you have to see these two signs to pass through. And I sometimes look at them like the Jurassic Park sign or the gateway that you see in the trailers. But it's just a sign of pride. And if you do go on YouTube, you can find that segment. But it's just amazing that you can have like 3,000-year-old sites with 21st century sites on the same map. Some of the motivations for this project are just different false narratives of our disappearance. So the most famous example is the Last of the Mohegans. It's kind of in the same realm of like the Last Samurai. Just these different like famous stories that are pretty much etched into our minds as Americans. Like we have to go save X people by becoming them or taking their place, or honoring them now that we established that they're disappeared but never really went and checked. But every time a Shinnecock person would pass away, they would say it's the last of the Shinnecock, and that would happen every single time for many decades. And so this is the to-do list for the On the Site project. Everything in red I still have to go and photograph. Everything in blue and green are available on the site. And if you are curious about mapping your own art project, I use WordPress, which is free, and WP Google Maps, which is a plugin. I think it's about $50 and it's a one-time fee. And you can just create your own maps in an infinite amount. So highly recommended if you are into mapping. And so I do want to talk a little bit about some of the projects that were inspired by this project on this site. One of them I'll just go into is called Rise. And now that I have this map of different places that connect us, we at Shinnecock, to places where we once thrived for 10,000 years, it's amazing to try to create a body of work that shows our presence in these places. And so I created Rise as a kind of more in the realm of contemporary art. Like if you go to New York City and you see some crazy stuff, it's kind of like in that realm. But these are all self-portraits. So these are just myself duplicated dozens of times sometimes, and wearing our traditional regalia. We call it regalia, not a costume. And I put on a wig to kind of disguise myself, and sometimes my face as a kind of a curtain. And so I wanted to create this body of work just to show that like we do have the capability of regaining lands or revisiting them or reusing them. And so now that I'm heading towards the end of my presentation, I do want to just point out, like, come visit us at the Shinnecock Powwow if you're in the area. If you do want to get some more resource material about Shinnecock, there's a great book called We Are Still Here by John Strong. And I do want to mention just briefly a project that's personal and recent for me. It's called Ma's House on the Shinnecock Reservation. And it's a communal art space that we renovated back in June 2020 during the peak of COVID. And it's this old house that I grew up in and my family grew up in built in the 1960s. And it's been vacant for the past 5 years. And so with social distancing and everything being closed, we just focused on renovating the house over that year. And so today it actually serves as my studio, my living space. These are just some of my artworks. It's also a space for community get together. So this is Shane Weeks, and he's doing a history class with other tribal members. It's also amazing because it'll house a lot of the research I have from on the site in person. And we have a BIPOC or a Black, Indigenous, people of color residency. So people of color who are artists or creatives can come and stay for 2 weeks and create something new and debut it or have open studios at the end of their time. So if you want to learn more or come visit us one day, the website's mashouse.studio, and we are a 501c3. So this will be the umbrella project for all the other kind of educational and public outreach series. And we're pretty much on the 45-minute mark, so I don't want to go over time, but these are just different ways that you can get in contact with me, from email, phone number, or my portfolio website. So I want to thank you all for listening. I know it was a lot of info, and if you have any questions or if you want me to go back any slides, I'll be happy to do that. But thank you for listening. I do want to also say, if you go to the Hope Horn Gallery and take some photos of the installation, please tag me and I'll like it, I'll share it, I'll follow you, and do all this stuff. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Jeremy? Thank you for that presentation. That was wonderful. I won't get started. I'll give everybody else a chance to contribute something if they have any thoughts. But I could go on and on. First, I would say that the photographs that are in the show are of landscapes and portraits of people from Shinnecock, but so there's a history component, but they are beautiful in terms of their clarity and their composition, and there's a strength. And again, I think the word I come back to again is sort of like this clarity and directness that I personally find really, really powerful. I do a lot of work with art and art history. We do a lot of local history. And so to be able to find the place where those two things merge, I think is a real challenge. And I think you've done it beautifully. And the past isn't even past if you can kind of find that place where that intersection exists. And it almost, again, it carries it into the future. And so I think you've done that in a really beautiful way. To put all of that information, again, from an art historical point of view, to compile that and digitize that and get that online in a usable form, again, is a daunting task. So it's not only beautiful work, it's a lot of work. And I understand sort of the complexity of that and the scope of it. So again, congratulations on that. And then the third thing I'd throw out there, I think that Ma's House is a really beautiful idea. And again, it's something that engages with a tradition on Long Island. A lot of artists have worked there over the past 150 years. William Merritt Chase has been there, and people like Jackson Pollock and the Pollock Krasner Foundation is out there. So any number of the abstract expressionists have been around and working in that area. And in a very contemporary way, you are connected to that and moving that forward as well, without missing a beat. So I think, again, that's a really beautiful component to all of the things that are happening here. So again, congratulations on some really, really great work in terms of history and in terms of the images and in terms of the engagement with the art community and also a broader community as well. So we are really, really happy. that you were able to present with us and exhibit at the gallery. So anybody else, now that I've kind of kicked all that in, if you do have any other questions and you're not able to stick around or we're running out of time, please let us know, either me at the gallery or Carolyn Bonacci through our Office of Community Relations. Either one of us, we can kind of gather things up and get in touch with Jeremy. And again, the websites and things are listed. So if you have any questions about any particular works, there's a lot of information about them, again, on those two sites, the On This Site and also the Shinnecock Portrait Project.
And I can share some of these sites out to everyone here and then email afterwards. And hello, hi. So I'm the Carolyn that was referenced, so I can send you an email out afterwards. But I also I do have a question for you, Jeremy, if that's okay. I'm really, first of all, really excited to see the full exhibition. I saw Dr. Miller Lanning starting to hang it the other day, and I was excited to like peek on the top of the stack of it. And I enjoyed checking out the websites too. But I'm really interested in something from your perspective. So as a Scrantonian, as someone who's from here, I think that one thing that really struck me when I was learning about your work before this lecture tonight, and then from your own, what you shared and what you discussed, is that here in Northeastern PA, through removal, there isn't really an Indigenous presence here. And I thought what was really striking about Shinnecock is that even though you're in a highly desirable piece of land in the Hamptons, that you've had this like ongoing continuous presence on the land for thousands of years, like even though some of it has been taken and, there are some things that were like, nefariously, like, tricking people out of land, but you have had that presence. So what has that meant for the Shinnecock Nation, like to be able to have your ancestral land still there and like to have, and actually to be reclaiming them, which is amazing. What does that mean? And then is there anything we could do in a location like ours where we don't have this continuous Indigenous presence to sort of facilitate, make inroads for different Indigenous communities to feel welcome back here in their lands?
Thank you, Carolyn, for those questions. Yeah, I always think about that all the time, the fact that we've been here on our traditional territory throughout the over 300 years of colonization and forced removal. And I think part of that is just some of our sachems or leaders, some of the decisions and sacrifices they made. So I think that we've always been labeled the good neighbors. And my cousin Shane Weeks, he wrote a book with that same title. The fact that like we've always been here, we've been the neighbors to the English colonists, we've provided them labor, our land, some of our traditions and ways of using some of our traditional plants and agriculture. And today, like you said, like a lot of the land was taken despite that friendship. And so I think some of the reason we're still here is because of the proactivity of Shinnecock leaders. Like I said, we had one leader, Wyandanch, who actually went to the more militant and just like a lack of better words, more genocidal English kind of conquerors in the New England area, and pleaded with them and said, like, even though you're having these clashes and these different, just wiping out of different villages that are Native American, we're different, we're here on Long Island, we'll accommodate you. And so that was actually a history that you can still see today through the largest private island called Gardiner's Island in East Hampton. And so Lion Gardner was that person that Wyandanch connected with. He became friends with him. He eventually gave him huge swaths of land. But I think that goodwill and that willingness to sacrifice to save the people was the reason why we're still here. We're also sort of part of that tradition of praying Indian towns. So even today we have a Presbyterian church, and we have a lot of kind of older generation Shinnecock who still maintain it, have every Sunday, we have Sunday services. And so I think a lot of that was part of the kind of the assimilation history of like, we did what you said, we followed your religion, and now we're able to kind of maintain our presence. But I think in the PA case, I think that's an interesting question because in Oklahoma recently, they had the Cobell case where something like half of Oklahoma is now kind of in the case of being Indian territory. And when I was at Penn State, I actually tried to network with other like indigenous communities or reservations, and just found like there were none in like 100-mile radius. And so I think it would be interesting if like you offer the Lenape like land, or give them territory that is still untouched or part of their historical landscape. And I think that especially here at Shinnecock, just the idea of having land and being able to sustain your people for future generations is such a huge gift, and a passageway for reconciliation, which still hasn't happened in this country. Oh, I think Julie has a question.
Yes, hi. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for your presentation and for all the work that you're doing. And I just wanted to pick up a little bit on Carolyn's question and some of what you just mentioned. We have, through this project, we have done some outreach and are very excited to hopefully be able to welcome some of the some leaders in the Lenape, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, back to what is, their ancestral homelands. And I think what Carolyn underscored is something that we're really trying to reflect on, is that we haven't had that presence in our region. And I think that it is a sad reality of American history that I hope we can, through engagement with your work and through relationship with them, that we can also, try to overcome in small ways. Obviously, we can't overcome it entirely. But I also had a question. My understanding is that for the Shinnecock, there's an intersection between Black and Native American history. And I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I was just curious if you might say a little bit more about that.
Oh, happy to. I think when we think of like New York and Ellis Island, we think of the melting pot. And for some reason, like when people came to America and their second generation of children were born, they became Americans because they were born here. But for Shinnecock, we're so close to that proximity of like migrants coming to America or just different groups. We also had the triangle slave trade from here, West Africa and the Caribbean. And so when America finally abolished slavery in the 19th century, a lot of those free Blacks were assimilated into Shinnecock. There was a history of some of our leaders dying in mass due to this one day, or this one infamous history called the Circassian shipwreck. And so I think that even the three leaders of Shinnecock during that time passed away on that day, and it left such a huge void in such a small community. And so I think that Shinnecock women sort of invited or absorbed these newly free Black slaves or Black community members, because they were also seeking belonging and support. I think both communities were. And so not only do we have people here at Shinnecock who are darker skinned, we have lighter skinned Shinnecock people. We're really all an array. So just me, for example, like I have Irish ancestry, I have Black ancestry, Shinnecock, of course, but we're still proud of who we are. And it's important to also note that we don't use blood quantum, we use matrilineal society. Our society is matrilineal. So we have mothers who pass down that status of being Shinnecock. And as long as you have that lineage, you can still enroll and be part of the community.
Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the exhibit. So we're excited here in Scranton that we can be able to receive that here. So thank you again.
Oh yeah, please check it out, take some selfies, share. I don't know if I'll make it in person, that's what I'm saying.
We are excited because on First Friday, there's usually a community art event, and we haven't done it for so long because of the virus. So First Friday, April 1st, will be our first public reception at the gallery in 2 years, I guess. We've had a lot of campus activity, the students come through, and so it's certainly not been a quiet space or an empty space. We've been very, very busy, but the doors to the public, everything was by appointment, or, it was a little bit more tightly structured. So our first big public event in 2 years on First Friday. So
Wow.
we're happy about that.
It's exciting. I have a lot of friend and alumni and professors at Penn State, so I'm sure they might be in the area or pass through and could stop by. So
Very
happy to
good.
promote.
Very good.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, if we are running out of time, I will say thank you once again. And I'll be in touch, I'm sure, as the show goes along. We'll send you some photos and some comments. And thank you again for speaking with us today. We're very pleased to have you with us.
Oh, well, thank you, and hope everyone can join us at the powwow or at Ma's house one day and enjoy your evening.
You as well.